Thanks to Stanford and Dr. Milani for inviting me. I hope you can all hear me, because the loudspeaker doesn't work very well. So I'm loud enough that the students can hear me way in the back. If you don't hear me, please raise your hand or speak louder so that I can speak louder. Okay, I'm going to be speaking for, let's say, half an hour or 40 minutes at most, and then we open it for question and answer. Okay. If you don't speak English, the second section, I can turn it into Farsi Persian and translate it for those who don't understand Persian. So we have different level of understanding. Okay, my book is about democracy in Iran, why it failed, and how it might succeed. Okay, I have an understanding of Iran and Iran's revolution and its outcome that's very different from current academic understanding. So I'll tell you a little bit about it, and then look at the challenges against the revolution and the Islamic Republic. And then we ended with a sort of aftermath of the Green Movement. And if you're interested, we can talk about the recent events in December and January that happened in Iran. Those are not included in the book. The book was published in 2016. And so it didn't need to. But I predicted that it would happen. I show you how. Oops. Roma. Something went wrong already. Okay. Now we have it. Great. Thank you. Okay. There are different understandings of what democracy means and what democratization is all about. I define democratization as the process of empowering the civilian population, ordinary people, vis-a-vis the state. So throughout human civilization, states in the Middle East and in Asia have been powerful, imposing dictatorial government, and democracy is supposed to be countering that by empowering the civilian population against the state. So above all, democratization requires what I call political equality, meaning that people have political rights and equal rights. So with democracy, you cannot have an aristocracy ruling the society and the state. So that's the first most important requirement of democracy and democratization. So you have to have rule of law, you have to have freedom of expression, freedom of association, gathering, protest, all of those things are part of democracy and democratization. If you don't have them, you are not empowering the civilian population. All of those items that people talk about fall under the category of empowering the civilian population and providing equal political rights for countries that are democratic. So the first consequence of that kind of an arrangement, that kind of a definition of democracy, is that democracy is incompatible with any kind of theocracy, whether it's Islamic, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, whatever you call it. What comes from God or from Allah cannot be rejected by the people. In democracy, people reject, people decide, people make the rules. And so democracy then is incompatible with theocracy and any kind of theocracy because they have irreconcilable conflicts that cannot be reconciled. Okay, I keep coming back to the same slide. Okay. The Iranian Revolution began with a pair of conflicts. There were two conflicts against the monarchy, against the Shah, in the latter part of the 1970s. The first one was about political freedom, and people wanted political freedom. In the summer of 1977, they started talking about freedom. The second conflict had to do with the issue of economic equity, better standard of living, improvement in the livelihood of the people, particularly the working and the middle classes. And the two conflicts, the political conflict and the economic conflict, the two of them, towards the end, joined together, produced an ideological conflict, which was the third conflict, and that was against the monarchy and in favor of an Islamic republic. Okay, so there were two conflicts produced a third conflict, and that ended the monarchy. The ideological conflict ended the monarchical system. Now, what happened after the revolution, the Islamic Republic produced what I call multiple irreconcilable conflicts. And these conflicts were, first, people still wanted political freedom. Economically, they lost. There was a major loss in their economic standing of the population. Then there were new conflicts that emerged within the Islamic Republic, and these were cultural conflicts. Then there were social conflicts. Then there were religious and anti-clerical conflicts and tendencies that we recently saw last month emerging in Iran. And the 5 sets of conflicts have produced a 6th one. The result of the 5 conflicts are ideological conflicts against the Islamic Republic. And now they are calling, at least a portion of the population is calling for an Iranian republic as opposed to an Islamic republic. This is new, has been since the Green movement. Okay, let's see. So the the monarchy produced 2 conflicts, became ideological conflicts, 3 conflicts. The Islamic Republic has produced 5 conflicts, and the 6th one is the ideological conflict. So the Islamic Republic is much more conflictual compared to the Shah's regime prior to 1979. Okay. During the revolutionary struggles, various social classes and groups emerged and demanded political or economic rights, depending on their class interests, depending on their capacity for collective action. So, who was the first one that started challenging? Sorry, please, sorry,
It's a hard place to find your way around. What are you doing? Sorry about that.
Please, no problem. I get a chance to drink a bit of water. Okay. So, Iranian intellectuals, like few other revolutions in the 20th century, stood in the forefront of the struggles against the monarchy. And they basically wanted, at the beginning, they wanted political freedom. That's all they wanted. And, okay. This guy keeps coming back. Okay. In the summer of 1977, 3 leaders of what is called the National Front, those who were supporters of Dr. Mossadegh, being Prime Minister of 1950s, they started demanding political rights and asking the Shah for political freedom and civil liberties. That's all it was. And then those demands were expanded by the participation of students and other intellectuals in the fall of 1977. And so most Iranian intellectuals in 1977 supported not an Islamic system. Don't get me wrong. There are a number of scholars who think that the Islamic Revolution began when intellectuals switched to supporting an Islamic revolution and Islamic republic. My understanding is somewhat different from it. The vast majority of Iranian intellectuals in 1977 were either socialist or supported some kind of liberal democracy. If you look at the 64 writers and poets in the fall of 1977 who participated in what is called in Iran Poetry Nights, of the 64 of them, 66% were secular socialist or some kind of Marxist. 28% of them were liberal nationalists, and only 6% were actually Islamists. And none of those 6% actually supported an Islamic theocracy that was to happen in 1979, 1980. Okay. So the intellectual ideology in the 1970s in moving into the revolution was really socialist or liberal and not an Islamic one. Okay. 2 major collectivities joined the intellectuals, and these were leftist students at Tehran University and Polytechnic and other universities throughout the country. These were not very large universities. At that time, the total number of students in the country were about 150,000 or so. And then a major social group that joined these struggles for freedom and democracy were bazaar merchants. Bazaar we mean in Iran, we refer to as merchants shopkeepers and artisans. They're all gathered together in Tehran Bazaar, very large place with about 100,000 people working there and controlling about 2/3 of the country's capital. Okay, so these are the main groups that started the struggle for political rights during the Shah's regime. Okay, in August of 1978, the Shah's regime decided, well, there were a few rounds of conflicts, and a number of people were killed during those conflicts, produced the cycles of 40 days of mourning and so forth. I don't want to make the story very long, but the Shah decided to introduce, towards the end of August of 1978, the Shah decided, we are going to introduce some reforms, and what he called was national reconciliation. A government that was prime minister was Mr. Sharif Imami. Sharif Imami came from a religious background, Islamic background, and the Shah thought, okay, he is going to be a good prime minister to take control of things and introduce some political reforms that would reduce the level of the conflicts. But what happened was that the announcement of reforms suddenly expanded the political conflicts from 70 cities up to August of 1978 to more than 170 cities. So the conflicts expanded once the Shah announced that, oh yeah, we are reforming things and we have the national reconciliation government. So it didn't work out, it backfired. More importantly, the reforms mobilized two other classes that joined the struggle for greater economic rights. This was the industrial working class, but also the middle class, white-collar employees that joined in and demanded changes in the economic sphere. Mostly they wanted greater salaries and benefits and so forth. Okay. By the end of the year 1978, Iranians gradually coalesced, demanding political changes as the working class and the middle class became more political. I'm sorry,
What? Why did they coalesce to support
the very good question. Very good question. But we can talk about those things because I'm trying to get to the quickly. We're trying to get to the program. Okay. Yeah. So what happened? They were demanding more wages, more salaries, greater rights in the workplace, and so forth. And the Shah was giving in to some of the demands, but not all of them. So there were a lot of changes happening. Here workers go on strike, there workers on strike. And so some of the demands were met, some were not met. Some would accept to go back, some didn't accept to go back. And so then the Shah, so this is a long story, this is going to go all night, if you like. So the Shah said, well, nobody's listening, imposed martial law in 12 cities. And brought a military government. After 2 months, brought a military regime government and Mr. Askari. And so everybody go home. Some people went home and went back to work, and some people didn't. And as they didn't, then bazaar merchants suddenly showed up. They said, we have a protracted struggle and conflict, and we are going to fight this out. And the bazaar merchants showed up. The workers in the south, mostly in oil refineries and oil rigs, please come in. Oil workers joined in and said, we are supporting the overthrow of the monarchy, and we are supporting actually a government that has two characteristics. One is anti-despotic, anti-despotism, the other one is anti-imperialist. And so they shut down the oil production, and so the lifeblood of the regime basically dried up. And so once oil wasn't, we couldn't sell the oil, bazaar merchants were on the strike, workers were on the strike, and particularly led by oil workers, and that finally was a big blow against the monarchy. By the way, a lot of people think that, oh, so workers they were supporting Khomeini. Yes, workers, merchants, everybody was supporting Khomeini. But everybody supported Khomeini because Khomeini was standing against despotism, he said, against dictatorship, all those things. The leadership of the oil workers in 1978, as the conflicts were going on, the oil workers organized this council, and about 35% of that council were avowedly declared that they were Marxist. So to think that workers are very religious and so they are supporting Khomeini wasn't really true. Yeah, most workers ended up in the end supporting Khomeini, as the rest of the population, everybody, by the end of 1978, everybody was supporting Khomeini. Not because everybody was an Islamist and wanted an Islamic theocracy, but they had their own demands, and oil workers in particular thought that, well, Khomeini comes and he takes power away from the wealthy and the rich and will improve our living standards, our conditions. So those were thoughts. Sorry, so I have to move on. I hope I connected the dots. This is a long story. If you have to talk about every aspect of this, this will be all night and days and months will go. Okay, by the end of 1978, Iranians coalesced to support the formation of an Islamic Republic. So we come back to this. There was on December 10 and December 11, what is called Tasua and Ashura marches. And this belongs to the Muharram, which is very important to the Shiites, the Shiite Muslims. And people knew that a lot of people would be participating because, first of all, two important religious holidays, but also the government said, as long as you do not shout anti-Shah slogans, death to the Shah and things like that, you can come and march. They said, no, okay, we won't shout any slogans against the Shah's regime, against the Shah. So permission was given. So they expected a lot of people would come, and a lot of people, more than 1 million people at least in Tehran, showed up. And all major cities, there were a lot of people who were participating in the march. So the organizers said, well, okay, we need to have some marshals to guide the march and the procession. And so we need every major political organization who are non-Marxist or non-communist to provide a list of names of people who would be able to guide the marches, to be marshaled. And this is a very fascinating story that most works, scholarly works, haven't gotten to. I became lucky at one point. Luckily, I was at Harvard and researching for my book, and by accident, I found this interview that had been given in 1982 to a Harvard librarian who had gotten some money to do research on, they called it oral history project. And so this was turned out. At the time, this is December 10, 11, 1978. The National Front, the liberals, gave names of 2,500 people. The militant clergy, Ayatollah Beheshti, and those who were following Ayatollah Khomeini, they gave names of 1,400 marshals, much less than the National Front. And then it was the freedom movement, who are Islamic liberals. They gave, led by Prime Minister Bazagan, they gave names of 800 people. And then finally, the Mujahideen families gave names of 400 to 500 people. And so this, in a way, is very nicely, very interestingly captures the capacity, organizational capacity of various groups at the time of the revolution. And so the clergy doesn't really have the great support that they ended up claiming and the power that they ended up grasping after the revolution. So, okay, because the clergy was not a politically active group until very recently, that we come close to the 1979 revolution. In fact, the first statement the clergy issued was in spring of 1978. So the National Front, which is a much older organization going back to the 1940s and 1950s. So this is very interesting fact that turned up in my research. Now, during those marches, Iranians acknowledged Ayatollah Khomeini to be the leader of the revolution. And Khomeini, in fact, emerged as the, I call him, undisputed leader of the revolution. And there were major reasons. First, he took an uncompromising stand against the Shah and his regime. So By this time, a lot of people are against the Shah, and that position was very much accepted by the vast majority of the people at the time. Okay? Second, Ayatollah Khomeini was in Iraq, but then finally in Paris, and all in domestic opposition were afraid of speaking out and criticizing the Shah the way he did, because he had greater freedom being outside of the country, and the people inside weren't as free. So were afraid of being arrested, put to jail, and so forth. Now, more importantly, Ayatollah Khomeini repeatedly promised freedom and an end to corruption. Those were some of the major themes that the Ayatollah spoke about while in Iraq, 15 years in Iraq, then a few months in Paris in the fall of 1978. Okay. Khomeini, these are some of the statements he made while he was in Paris and when he came back to Iran. So I don't want to make the long story short. You can read it very quickly. In Islamic government, there is no dictatorship. We think that force and repression are not the means to progress. There is no repression in Islam. There is freedom in Islam for all classes, for women, for men, for whites, for blacks, for everyone. Never allow a small group to rule over you, like the bitter days of despotism of the past. Do not forget the principle of Islamic democracy. Repression has been buried and will not return when he was back in Iran. So the Ayatollah made great promises, and so Iranians liked a lot of these promises. Okay? Khomeini then made even more important promises, and let's take a look. Oops. Promo. Somehow I pressed too hard, I think. Oops, it came back. Okay. Maybe it went to sleep.
Maybe.
I need to wake it up occasionally. It's old like me, it falls asleep. Now, once in power, Khomeini pursued free policies that were first. He rejected political freedom and democratic institutions that he had been promising for years, that the Shah was a dictator and Islam is not going to be dictatorial. And so he and his allies, what he did quickly, seized the assets of the wealthy part of the population, and then he imposed social and cultural restrictions. Okay, so Khomeini undermined prospects for democracy by establishing a theocratic regime. So he established a theocracy that appoints somebody by the name of the Velayat-e-Faqih. So now it's commonly called the supreme leader, basically. And the supreme leader is the one who in the Constitution says that in the absence of the 12th Imam, he is the leader of the Islamic community. So that is a very important, powerful position. In the absence of the 12th Imam, the Mahdi, the supreme leader of the Velayat-e-Faqih, is the one to follow. So we have appointed somebody that basically represents Allah. And when the Constitution of the Islamic Republic, actually the referendum for the Islamic Republic was passed, Khomeini, they put it to a referendum. Do you want monarchy or you want the Islamic Republic? And the vast majority, of course, voted for an Islamic Republic. Who wants monarchy? Because we just overthrew it, and a few thousand people were killed in overthrowing it. So he didn't give an option of, do you want democracy or Islamic Republic? He said, we want monarchy or Islamic Republic? And everybody said Islamic Republic, of course. And the Islamic Republic wasn't clear what was the political rule was going to be. And he congratulated the Iranian people and said, this is the same as God's government. It's an Islamic Republic, but it's the same as God's government. And those are big words. Iranian people at the time didn't figure out what he was talking about. It's the same as God's government. Now, Khomeini said, the Velayat-e-Faqih, the supreme leader is going to be strong and powerful. People said, well, why do we need to have a strong Velayat-e-Faqih, supreme leader? It doesn't make any sense. And we just got rid of one very powerful person. But he said, this is to prevent dictatorship. That was his response. And so it was supposed to prevent dictatorship. So what he established in the end was what I call an exclusive state that basically eliminated all the rivals and their allies as well, and established a harsher regime than it had replaced. The fate of the Revolutionary Council is very interesting. The Revolutionary Council were 26 people who, after the revolution, were composed by Khomeini's endorsement and so forth, to rule the country for about first year of the life of the Islamic Republic. Out of these 26 political leaders, 4 of them were assassinated. Please come in. Out of 26, 4 of them were assassinated during the first year of the Islamic regime. One of them died very mysterious, the Ayatollah Talabani, when he criticized, in one of his sermons, criticized the Islamic regime. He himself was an Ayatollah, but he was too liberal. He criticized what was going on in the country. 3 days after his sermon, he died very mysteriously in mysterious sleep. Apparently people say his medication were changed. So out of the 26, then we had 21 survived. 21 survived until after 2009 and 2010. Out of this 21, 19 of them were either against the Islamic Republic, had joined the opposition, had joined the reformists. One was executed, Khomeini, who was Iran's foreign minister during the hostage crisis. He was executed in the mid-1980s. Please come in.
Thank you.
Was executed, and 1 or 2 basically withdrew. One, I think, withdrew from politics, and so out of the 21, Ayatollah Rafsanjani became also critical with the conservative faction of the Islamic Republic. Out of 21, we had 2 that fully supported the Islamic Republic and the conservative faction. And guess who those 2 people were? One was Ayatollah Khomeini, the supreme leader, current supreme leader. The other was Ayatollah Mahdavi Kani, the head of the Assembly of Experts that appoints the supreme leader. So those 2 were the survivors. The rest of them basically had been in the opposition, forced out, and some things happened. Okay. Ayatollah Khomeini. Once we got to 1981. 1979, revolution happens, and 1981, Bani Sadr is removed. First, Bazargan was removed. He was a member of the Revolutionary Council, and then Bani Sadr, elected as president, he was removed. In the fall of 1981, Ayatollah Khomeini said, to protect Islam, you can lie, you can spy, you can even drink alcohol. This would happen. An exclusive state that ended up doing this kind of thing. Khomeini also produced more important things and promised to reduce inequalities and serve the interests of what he called mustazafin, the poor mustazafin. The 5 days after he came back, he was speaking about mustazafin. I've read all of his writings, okay, not religious writings, all the political writings, social issues and so forth, nothing about religious practices and so forth. He has different kinds of writings. So all of the ones that were addressed to the Iranian people and had to do with an Islamic Republic and its nature and so forth, all the statements he made from 1963 when he was jailed all the way to 1979 and throughout all the period that he was in power to 1989 when he died. I've looked at all of them, and before 1979, he only once used the term mustazafin, the poor, the oppressed, the downtrodden. But after he came back, he kept talking about mustazafin, the downtrodden, the poor. And of course, it was a very good way of surviving. And this is a time when the regime is overthrown and leftist forces became very powerful, very strong. So Khomeini realized to get the support of the working class and part of the middle class, you need to keep talking about serving the poor, the oppressed, and all that, in order to eliminate the left from competition. And it was somewhat successful. Islam will serve the interests of the Muslims, the oppressed, and the deprived. And so I hope you can read the rest of it. In the interest of time, I'm going to shift and get to the next slide. I hope it's okay with you. Okay. But the clergy managed to control the resources of the country. As soon as the monarchy is overthrown, much of the assets of the monarchy was expropriated by the clergy. They established these monopolistic entities called various bonyads and foundations, and they control basically until today about over 50% of Iran's economy. And so the assets of one organization that's under the control of Ayatollah Khomeini, it's called Setad Ijrai Farman Hazrat Imam. That alone, according to research by Reuters, has assets more than $95 billion. That's just one of his the foundations that is under. The Revolutionary Guard also emerged to become what I call sarcastically the first armed bourgeoisie in Iran's history. These are armed bourgeoisie. When you make a bid, this is a capitalist corporation, this is like a company, but it's a company that comes when there's any bid, they come with arms. Who's going to win when you come with arms? This armed bourgeoisie. You're going to win without any bid often. It's one of the cases that caught my attention. In the Persian Gulf in Esh, they got this contract without any bids with the government. And this was more than 1 billion euros. Dollars, sorry. 970, something like that, euros, but over $1 billion. They took the money, they performed about 2% of the task, and then told the government, we can't do the rest of it, get lost. And the government said, well, they are more powerful. As I said, this is armed bourgeois. And when you come with arms, nobody can challenge it. The government cannot challenge it. So basically, they call the shots. So they control, this is an estimate by the economists that about 20% of Iran's economy is controlled by the Revolutionary Guard. Okay, let's move on. Now, comparison of the life of Iranian people after the revolution. In 1979 and 1980, Iran's GDP per capita, or per capita GDP, 1979-1980 was exactly equal to the per capita GDP of South Korea. 1979 and 1980, both years, they were very similar. By the time you get to 2009, when the green movement is going on, Iran's GDP per capita is less than 1/3 of that of South Korea. That is the tragedy for the Iranian people. Those who wanted to improve their economic conditions, this is what happened to them. Ranking of Iran's GDP per capita in 1976 to 2009. This is what the figures look like this. 1976, Iran had its highest GDP per capita in the history. And it was in 1976, Iran's GDP per capita was $13,300. That's the dollar that was denominated in 2005. But in 2005 dollars, Iran's GDP per capita was $13,300 in 1976. $13,300 in 1976. By the time you get to 2009, when the green movement was going on, Iran's GDP per capita, again, denominated in 2005 dollars, Iran's GDP dropped to $9,400. So between 1979 and 2009, 30 years, instead of Iranians gaining, their GDP per capita declined. And then by 2015, Iran needed to boost its GDP per capita by about 76% to catch up with what they had in 1976, according to Iqtisad News that's published in Iran. And that's what happened to Iran's economy. So you're following me? So they lost in the political round. Instead of having a political freedom and the things that he was promised, they got a supreme leader that basically represents God. So in Farsi, we say, as chale chop, from ditch into the well. In English, we say, from the frying pan into the fire. That's what happened. And then economically, this is what they lost. Okay. Then there was, of course, rising inequalities and to unprecedented corruption and cronyism. That's rampant in Iran. Unprecedented that no one really has heard of in Iran's history. That's what has been going on in Iran. So I make to make the long story short, and inequalities expanded worse than what it was during the Shah's time. The Gini coefficient increased. Since I don't have a lot of time, I'll be very quick. The Gini coefficient is what is a measure index of inequality in the distribution of income. Vittorio Gini was an Italian sociologist and statistician that came up measuring with this. So since I don't have time to tell you all about that part, so the lower the number, when you look at Gini coefficient, the lower the number, the more equality. The higher the number is more inequality. So during the Shah's time, in the late 1970s, inequalities were rising. So people argued that that was one of the reasons for the conflicts against the Shah, the struggle for freedom and all that. So Ahmadinejad kept arguing that, we have reduced the Gini coefficient, inequalities have declined in Iran, and we are doing great, we are very successful. I looked at the same numbers, and I did the math. He was lying. The numbers they give to the United Nations are very low, showing that Iran is very egalitarian. But when you do the math, the numbers are really different. And so Iran's inequality is very high right now, and it's very similar to some of the Latin American countries that have been historically have had very high levels of inequalities. So this was promises to reduce inequality. So there's polarization of wealth and income. So you take the top 1% to bottom 1%, or you take the top 10 to bottom 10, or top 20 to bottom 20. All of them show very high level of inequality in the country. Even Ayatollah Khomeini, and you can read the statement. Khomeini in 2003, dispensing economic justice has been one of the regime's most cherished yet unrealized goals since its establishment nearly a quarter century ago. So even the regime itself admits that inequalities haven't been able to deal with them. Okay. Now, the third one and this last one. But the last one before I get to the green one, so there's a lot to come. I apologize. It's a long evening here. So here we have the regime had promised all the freedoms and democracy and so forth, but what they did, the theocracy imposed social and cultural restrictions that none of the major participants in the revolutionary coalition had asked for. The result was that Iranian people who had freedom in their personal lives to listen to music, to dress the way they want to, or to drink alcohol, or to go and dance, or whatever you want to do in your personal lives, they lost those freedoms. And so the result was that those personal liberties that they had taken away from them. Not only they lost economically, they lost politically, but they also lost socially and culturally. And so this brings the whole thing together. So drinking and some music were forbidden. Women cannot sing any longer. Some of the best Iranian singers historically have been women. And I said, no, women cannot sing. Wherever there are men. And of course, not on the radio, television, because there are a lot of men that are listening or watching it. So, women can sing for women, but not for everybody else. Okay. And women were relegated very quickly to second-class citizenship, and women's dress and makeup were restricted. And so I'll come back about this a little later. So for all these changes, that in a way, when I look at it, people were forced into Firdaus. So those of you who are Persian here, and I see a lot of Persians, and Firdaus is a term that most Iranians don't don't use as much, and so it means basically paradise. The Greeks who went to Persia, old days I'm talking about, learned what there is something called Firdaus, and they didn't have F in their language, so they said Firdaus. And eventually came into English language as paradise. And so that's what you got from the Persians going back a few thousand years ago, that Zoroaster had come up with the idea for this. So basically what the Islamic Republic did, they have put chains and shackles on their hands and on their feet, and they're dragging them forcefully into heaven. What a heaven it is. And so this is what people hadn't asked for, but they were forced to. There were casualties in the revolution, and during the revolutionary struggles, 3,000 people, close to 3,000, not exact, close to 3,000 people were killed between 1977 and February 11, 1979. Now many more people were killed resisting the theocracy. And between 1981 and 1985, and I'm not including the people who were right after the revolution were executed by several hundred people, army generals and so forth, were executed by the Islamic regime. But between 81 and 85, nearly 12,000 people lost their lives. And then 2 months during the summer of 1988, 5,000 people were executed. And recently, the International Tribune investigated it and called it crime against humanity. What happened in 2 months, 1988, Ayatollah Khomeini ordered the execution of 5,000 people, and so constitutes as a crime against humanity. Okay. Now, despite this, what I call endless repression that the Islamic Republic has imposed on the population, we have had challenges against the Islamic regime. First one comes 1999, 2003, 2009, and now we just had the 2017, 2018 hasn't ended yet, so I'll tell you what I'm predicting, my book predicted. Students remain, just like the revolutionary struggles, students remain in the forefront of the struggle. And more than 4,000 of them were killed between 81 and 85 that we just talked about. And then students protested again in 1999 and again in 2003. One of their very popular slogans that was just picked up just this past month by the poor, I call them poor people's movement, in 2017, end of 2017, early 2018. They picked it up, and the slogan was that the people are miserable, the clerics are acting like God. Millat gedai mikonad, mullah khodai mikonad. That's a very challenging slogan that attacks the very foundation, the economic, the political, the ideological foundation of the Islamic Republic. Who can claim to be God? And that's what the students were shouting. The poor people now, in last month, they picked up the same slogan and they were shouting the students' slogan. And then the students protested again in 2003. They were all harshly repressed because the students often are alone. The students are usually in the vanguard of struggles against any dictatorial regime. And without students, but also in Iran, without women and students, we won't have much of anything. Those are the two groups that are fighting, have been fighting for a long, long time. And they were unfortunately repressed, and what happened, their struggles was picked up in 2009 during the Green Movement. And the Green Movement happened during the presidential election, and so it was a disputed election. So the opposition said we won, and they had evidence to present that they won. The regime claimed that Ahmadinejad won. So one side was claiming Mousavi won, and the other side said, no, Ahmadinejad won. And so the initial conflict in the struggle was, where is my vote? What happened to my vote? And my vote has gotten lost and wasn't counted. And there was fraud and dishonesty. And on June 15, an estimated 3 million people marched silently in Tehran, demanding to know what had happened to their votes. Okay, so a week later, about 4 or 5 days later, on June 19, Ayatollah Khomeini warned the people to stay off the streets, And he said, Ahmadinejad has won, and anybody that's against it is going to be punished. And so the opposition leaders were warned that you're going to be held responsible for the bloodshed. And so protesters, as soon as Ayatollah Khomeini, the election was on June 12th. On June 19, Khomeini said the last word that he said, Ahmadinejad has won and it's finished. It's completely done. And the people who were talking about where is my vote, they changed their slogan, death to the dictator, and then death to Khomeini. So basically 1 week after the election, they were radicalized, and they were calling death to Ayatollah Khomeini and death to the dictator and so forth. And so it became increasingly radicalized. So became increasingly radical. Khomeini is a murderer, and his leadership is revoked. Khomeini قاتله, velayatish باطله. We did not give our lives to compromise and won't praise the murderous leaders. Okay. Other revised, and they were calling for independence, freedom, Iranian Republic, as opposed to the revolutionary slogan 1979 when they were calling for independence, freedom, Islamic Republic. Now, and the Poor People's Movement, also they started calling for Iranian Republic. So it became very radical. 1 week after the election, the movement became very radical and demanded major changes in the country. Now, to circumvent the repression that the regime was imposing, the dissidents wrote slogans. As soon as repression came, they started to say, well, what do we do? They said, write our slogans on currency notes, on the bills. And so bills are circulating with pictures of Khomeini crossed out, or slogans, and slogans included death to the dictator, down with Khomeini, and fear the storm of dust and dirt. Dust and dirt comes from a statement that right after the election, Ahmadinejad was asked, he claimed that he has won. So journalists said, so what do you think these people in the streets are saying? They're saying that you lost and you say you won, so what's your response? Ahmadinejad said, well, after every football game, people make a lot of noise and people jump up and down and they produce dust and dirt. And these are dust and dirt, those people. And so these people came out and say, well, fear the storm of dust and dirt. Okay, that's what we are. Okay, so the government basically was forced to collect those bills and outlaw the activities. And a lot of money was wasted by doing that. They had to reprint the money, which they do every day anyway. But that's why Iranian currency is so worthless. So, in response to the protests, the regime speeded up repression. I promised you to be short, but you know what? I had to wait for people to walk in, so it's not all good. So this is getting a bit longer, so if you don't mind, I will speed up a little bit so that we can talk more. Okay. In the 50 days after the presidential election, the regime executed about 115 people. These were not even announced. This is according to Amnesty International that had the count. And it was to intimidate. Many of these people were drug dealers or peddlers, and so they were executed to intimidate the political opposition. You see, this was, and some of the 115 were also political prisoners who were executed during the time. And authorities at one point banned shouting Allahu Akbar. I said, my goodness, this is an Islamic Republic. You can't shout Allahu Akbar in an Islamic Republic. What has happened to this Islamic Republic? They came to power with shouting Allahu Akbar, but that's what they were frightened. But during 1978-79, they were going to rooftops and shouting Allahu Akbar, and the same thing was happening again. And some universities were told the students, don't come with green objects. And a lot of people came with green objects, women with scarves or various kinds of things, and so they were banned. Okay. Ayatollah Khomeini warned against political activities. I'm going to move from this one to the next. This is all repression. Now, the Green Movement re-emerged in 2011. End of 2010 and 2011, if you remember it, in end of 2010, somebody was overthrown in Tunisia. Anybody remembers? Ben Ali, thank you. Ben Ali was overthrown. And then on February 11, 2011, somebody else was overthrown in Egypt. On February 11, the same day the Shah was overthrown in Iran in 1979. February 11, 2011 now, Mubarak was overthrown in Egypt. And so the opposition said, first, the government said, the conservatives said, okay, this is the impact of the Islamic Revolution. These are all anti-imperialist, anti-American. You see, the Islamic Revolution is spreading. The opposition quickly, Mousavi and Karoubi, the two leaders, they picked up, they said, oh yes, we want to have a march in support of all these people who are fighting for democracy. The regime said, you want to support them? Finish. So quickly arrested the two leaders and put them under house arrest and banned the protests and demonstration. So first they supported it, but as soon as the opposition said, oh yeah, we want to speak in favor of these protesters that you're supporting that have been successful, they said, of course not. And so they blocked them. Okay. Okay, we talked about this. We have to move a little quickly. Promise. It's almost 7:30 or so. The Green Movement ended up shaking the foundation of the Islamic Republic. The protesters, their mobilization and the scale of the protest and swift radicalization of the movement participants. They basically targeted the economic, political, and social ideological foundation of the Islamic Republic. They didn't want to have any part of it. And more importantly, the regime basically, it became clear that the regime had lost the support of important portions of its own base, including the Revolutionary Guard. Okay, to repress the movement, the Green Movement I'm talking about, they had to bring the Basij from various cities. Make a long story short, some of the commanders and leaders of the Revolutionary Guard apparently, according to their own statements, were not interested in repressing the Green Movement. And so they said, okay, what do? We need to bring in more troops, and troops may not shoot. And so if people come out and don't shoot, then that will cause all kinds of problems. So they said, we bring in Basij. And they were lucky that they had the Basij. This is General Jafari down here at the bottom. Says, had the Basij not existed, we don't know what might have happened. And it is possible that the seditionists might have achieved their goals, and meaning overthrowing the regime. And so they were able to bring Basij from smaller and medium-sized cities to Tehran and large cities and repress the opposition. So after the movement, during all these conflicts, 10 commanders of the Revolutionary Guard who had participated in Iran-Iraq war died in less than 1 year. 4 of them, these commanders, died in 4 consecutive days. And nobody explained why this happened, what happened to these Revolutionary Guard commanders. Okay, the movement in the end failed. Sorry, I had to move quickly. I know you're writing. The movement failed to democratize Iran largely because of 4 major reasons. One was insufficient leadership, that Mousavi and Karoubi did not play a leading role, particularly at the beginning. There was a disjunction between the leadership and the protesters, and then there was also limited solidarity structures, and they failed to consolidate and form a broad coalition. And those factors were important in the failure of the Green Movement and the success of the Islamists during the 2009-2010, all the way going to 2011. So why was the leadership insufficient? The leadership was insufficient because at the beginning, the leaders, Mousavi and Karoubi, basically they were following the events rather than leading. Mousavi showed up during the first protest on June 15, and he told the protesters, millions of people, 3 million in Tehran, and he said, well, this doesn't have, he wanted to ask them not to participate in a march or any event because he had asked for a permit, they didn't give him permit. So we said, don't go. People just said, we are participating in this, 3 million people, how do you block them? How do you prevent them? So and then finally he showed up and he said something about thanking them and so forth. Okay. Okay. And he happened to be an admirer of Ayatollah Khomeini, which a lot of people didn't want to. And he also urged the protesters to be faithful to the Islamic Republic and to the sacred Islam. And a lot of people didn't like the sacred element of the Islamic Republic that Misagh was talking about, asking the people to remain faithful. So there were the people are asking for one thing, Misagh and Karoubi are asking for another thing. And they said, those people who are among you who are shouting radical slogans, they are part of the regime. They are provocateurs. And that's what is going on. Don't get fooled. But so the majority of the people who were shouting radical slogans, and so you have 5 people, 10 people who are trying to provoke. But these people were hundreds and thousands and sometimes millions of people who are shouting radical slogans. They're all agents of the regime participating in it. It didn't make any sense to the people. Okay. As in the past, there were problems with the solidarity structure of the movement. Students remained in the forefront of those struggles. We had 112 people died during those protests of the Green Movement. 112 people died, not the executions. 100 people died during the protests in the street. Out of those 112 people, we had the occupation of a whole bunch of them. 50% of those whose occupation were clear were students, basically, mostly students from universities and colleges that died during the protests. They were students. Okay. Women also stood in the forefront of the struggles. 50% of those killed during the Green Movement were women. The New York Times reported sometimes when both boys and girls were fighting against the thugs and the Basij and so forth, throwing stones and shouting slogans. Sometimes the boys, often they get hit a little bit harder, they would run away, and the women said, "You cowards, come back!" And that was the extent of the struggle of women and getting the boys to come and join them and fighting against the Islamic Republic. Okay. Highly educated professionals were the second category who participated. These were often intellectuals and high education, doctors, lawyers, journalists in particular, professors. And these people had broken up from the Islamic Republic from very early on. This was the first group that broke away from the Islamic Republic and opposed the Islamic Republic. During that time, a lot of them were arrested, imprisoned, some were killed, and some left the country. But during these protests, after the students, that was the second large category. About 22% of those whose occupation were clear were professionals of the 112 people that we talked about. Okay. Self-employed also participated in the Green Movement protest, and about 10% of those slain, those killed, were self-employed. Workers also participated, not as a collectivity, not as industrial workers, but as individuals had participated, and they constituted about 18% of those killed during the repression. Okay. And so there were other categories that did not participate in the struggle, and that resulted in the failure of the Green Movement. And the clerics basically were absent because they are now the beneficiary of the revolution, and only 7 clerics were arrested during the protests that lasted exactly 20 months with the Green Movement. Most bazaar merchants who had participated in the 1979 revolution did not participate in the Green Movement, and so they were also repressed. The bazaars in Tehran were getting ready to go on strike. Actually, some of them were on strike, and one of the leaders of the bazaar was attacked by the militias and was murdered during the Green Movement protest. So bazaars stayed away from joining the movement. Okay, the industrial workers I talked about also didn't participate, and 18% of the slain were industrial workers. And the labor repression was very intense after the revolution because they had moved towards the left, or the left was very active among industrial workers. So Khomeini didn't like it, and so their repression was very intense and lost. but 70 to 90% of Iranian workers have basically no job security. They have no unions, and as a result, they don't have the solidarity to fight. They are in a very precarious situation, and they ended up not being a participant during the Green Movement. Okay, the absence of this broad coalition resulted in the failure of the Green Movement. And so the movement happened basically in major large cities. Medium-sized and smaller cities didn't have anything to contribute to the protest during the Green Movement. These were some of the cities where the protests occurred. Okay, and small and medium-sized were. So the regime was able to recruit its Basij militias, and this is few million people we are talking about. People are paid who are civilian people who are given some training but given monthly salaries, and whenever they are needed to beat up on the protesters and the people, they are recruited, and then once it's done, they go back to their own work, to their own lives, and when they are needed, they come out and repress protesters, students and women, and so forth. So these were some of the things that happened. After the Green Movement failed, and I'm almost done, okay, I promise this time, I'll make sure that after the Green Movement ended, the clergy came with a new ideological twist. And the ideological twist was that regime's legitimacy is not dependent on the approval of the population. The people don't have any say about whether the regime is legitimate or not. Legitimacy comes from God, the Prophet, and the 12th Imam, the people. Now, what did it contradict? This claim contradicted what is written in the Constitution of the Islamic Republic, because we have documents of the Constitution, fortunately, not just in books and papers, but also now we have the internet, and it's all there. And the Constitution says, as you can read, God has made man the master of his own social destiny. No one can deprive man of this divine right, nor subordinate it to the vested interest of a particular individual or group. We come to a situation in which the rulers of the Islamic Republic are contradicting their own claims about what rights human beings have. The rights that were given after the revolution by the Constitution now is contradicted and denied by the Islamic Republic. So now you can see where we're going. The Iranians continued the passive resistance, and this is the last section. Passive resistance actually began right after the 1979 revolution and has continued until today. Until today, right now, at the moment as we speak, Iranians are engaged in passive resistance. In 2005, 2015, the regime spent more than $2 billion to teach people about Islamic culture and Islamic values. And what are those cultural values and Islamic practices? Well, you should abide by the rules of not drinking, cover your hair, and don't listen to bad music, and so many things that came after the revolution. Iranians violated basically every aspect of those. Many Iranians refused to attend mosques. About 5% of Iran has about 60,000 Shiite mosques. About 5% of them are annually fully operational. The rest of them, this is government's own statistics. 86% of Iranian youth, university and college students, high school students, do not say the obligatory daily prayer. And 75% of the entire population do not say the obligatory prayer that you just mentioned. Okay. So, elementary school students, according to government officials, come to school drunk. High school students, same thing. Some of these Iranians are converting. The favorite religion to convert to is Christianity. And a lot of Iranians are converting to Christianity. Majority of them might watch the satellite dishes. That's forbidden, has been forbidden since early 1990s. Women constitute the most rebellious category in Iran. And so, as we speak, I should tell you, maybe take a little bit of time after the question and answer. So women refuse to observe restriction on the head covering. And so makeup, this fascinates me. Iran's population is about 17th in the world, according to Iran's Ministry of Health. And the makeup consumption is about ranked 7th in the world. Iranian women use 4 times more mascara than French women. And this is forbidden, supposed to be practically forbidden. So 80% of high school girls have boyfriends. I grew up in Iran. I didn't see a single girl to have a boyfriend. I didn't know anything about it. In colleges and universities, yeah, when you get older, but not in high school. And so this is, as we speak in the past few days, as we are talking, have you noticed it? The New York Times had an article a few days ago. One woman showed up on Revolution Street, and she took her scarf off, put it on a stick, and started waving it. That has produced a lot of other women. 29 until 2 hours ago when I came here, about 29 of them have been arrested. So they continue this struggle. They are not silent. They do not remain silent. And they don't want to have any of the things going on. Okay. Girls in the religious city of Qom don't want to marry clerics. And Qom is the capital, right, of Islamic faith, and girls and these young clerics who are supposed to be the rulers of the country cannot find mates sometimes, and that makes it very painful for them. Young people is a fire festival. I should move on because there's too much to talk about what it means and all that. The fire festival is celebrated, although the regime said this is for pagans and all that. It comes from Zoroastrian jumping over the fire. At any rate, perhaps most striking in the use of the ballot instead of the bullet and clergy standing in politics. The number of clergy that were elected to the parliament in the first parliament in 1980, about 164 of them, constituted about 60.7% of the first parliament were clerics. By the time you come to 2016, when my book was published, that was reduced to 5.5%. So more than 90% drop for the clergy's membership in the parliament. And that's huge. So there are only, right now, this is the parliament I'm talking about. Right now there are only 16 members of the parliament that are clerics, 16 out of 290. And the first parliament was 164 out of 270 members. And so this is, Iranians have been fighting them at every level. This is my last slide, and I want to thank you for being patient. And this is the last slide, which I predicted something to come. More than 3 decades after the formation of the Islamic Republic, Iranian society is more polarized than ever before. On the one hand, the regime insists on the continuation of the theocratic structures. On the other hand, people are engaged in widespread passive resistance and refuse to live in accordance with the rules of the theocracy. The persistent conflicts have compelled the regime to resort to endless repression. More importantly, the contradictions have generated irreconcilable conflicts and set the stage for protests and clashes that have yet to reach a climax. And history has already partially vindicated me in the last month. Thank you for your patience.